There we go.
I would like to know if groundwater ever replenishes aquifers, or whether aquifers get used and not replenished.
I can cite an example, the Ogalla Aquifer in the American Southwest. That is an aquifer that is replenished, but it is also being pumped out at a more rapid rate than it's being replenished. So water level in the aquifer are going down. So that's a classic example.
What about in our area where it's below rock?
Yeah, see, I'm not an expert in groundwater, so I can't really say much on this particular region because I just it's dangerous.
Linda, we live in a country where the federal government at the present time is actively downplaying climate change as an issue. To what extent do you find that impedes the willingness of provincial or local governments in coming to grips with the problem and starting to think seriously about adaptation?
Adaptation actually is happening quite strongly at the local and the provincial level. Adaptation and also mitigation. There are a number of research programs that are actively encouraging communities. There's the Ontario Regional Adaptation Collaborative that's federally funded, but partnerships from the province-led, that's actually starting to think about and providing information to help with adaptation with respect to water resources, with respect to human health, and I forget what the third sort of thematic area. A lot of people say that adaptation is local, that I agree in part with that. I think we need, clearly we need some people who can take a leadership role, whatever scale that is. I think we need people who are early innovators from which others can learn and are willing to learn. So that, I don't care what scale it happens at. It's like the Muskoka Watershed Council. It's self-organizing, it's innovative, and so those are the kinds of organizations I think that are already well placed to be able to start to think about adaptation.
What effect do you see potentially of the current negotiations between the federal government and European governments for a comprehensive economic and trade agreement that in which water resources are part of the negotiations, and municipal governments stand to lose control of water treatment and water resources to some degree?
Oh, that's a hard question. Being a researcher, so the question was, what do I think about the international negotiations with respect to water and how that might influence local municipalities being able to manage their water? Did I do that correctly?
Yeah, there's currently negotiations are going on between the Canadian government and European governments to develop a comprehensive economic and trade agreement. Part of those negotiations have to do with water resources and rights to water resources. So, we can have all the science that you're giving us, but if we don't have the right, if we've given away the right to control of our own resources, where does that leave us?
That's the question. You're actually asking. Here's the challenge for someone like me. I'm a researcher, right? I don't get involved in the policy process at all. Even with the IPCC, part of what we try to do is provide information that's policy relevant and not prescribe what policy should be taken. So that's a very uncomfortable question for me, because my thinking is I try to provide policy relevant information and let the policy people who are charged or elected to do that make the policy discussion, take part in the policy discussion. I mean, there's a because that's the way one maintains one's scientific credibility in many cases too.
Just on that point, I think that's a very good question, and I will endeavor to put that question to the local member, federal member, and get a response. A couple of years ago, asked him about water in a new piece of legislation that came out of water, for example, that is under federal jurisdiction, which is generally the Great Lakes. The answer at the time was it would not be there because it's not a boundary water. You're upstream in the scope. You're not in the boundary water. So that was the simple answer. But I will take your question and revisit it with you.
Seems like we're in the middle of climate change. And that's news to me, actually. It's like the writing's on the wall now.
Yeah, and I think that's a science and a policy statement.
Okay, so that's good to know. That should be headlines in the newspaper. Now, my question is, can we back up the bus a bit here and say, is there any way of slowing this down, like taking responsibility? I know they talk about it. I'm saying, now that you've determined, actually established that we have ourselves a very serious problem, have you determined exactly, or the main sources of the problem? And is there a way of, turning the dial down? And is anyone ready to participate in that, turning the dial down? I know there are world summits on this, but honestly, has there been actual change? Have you turned the dial down significantly? Is anything happening truly? Like, what are the sources, the great sources of climate change?
There's the greenhouse gases, and those have been identified. If you go to the IPCC site, it'll give you the summary of all of the different greenhouse gases and how much they contribute to that. There's a whole international process that's trying to negotiate Framework Convention on Climate Change. I mean, that's part of, there are people trying to do that. I would say that there are also sort of locally led, like ICLEI, I can't remember the long form, municipalities, the 20% club. Municipalities, communities are making concerted efforts, locally organizing, and from the bottom up, contributing to reducing greenhouse gases. I've been working on the issue of climate change since I don't know if I really want to talk about how long, but at least since 1988, right? In 1988, we had the Changing Atmosphere Conference in Toronto, hosted by Gro Brundtland and Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. In 1988, they put forward the whole idea of reducing emissions of greenhouse gases. So, I mean, there has been an incredible amount of progress made when you stop and think, even when you try and get hundreds of countries to agree to things, let alone communities to get to agree. I mean, people are, in 1988, there were so many people who still didn't believe that there was a greenhouse effect and that we could influence that.